Baldwin says, I am not interested in your guilt. I am interested in your responsibility. One thing when people would ask him, what should we do? I get that question from interviewers all the time. And he would say, I want you to come to terms with your history. And Baldwin's not somebody who's going to give us a direct response to all the policy questions we have before us. But he thinks the foundation of all those policy debates is going to be, we have to have the willingness and the courage to come to terms with our history. And he says it's going to be painful, but it's a responsibility that we have as human beings. And it's the only way that we're going to move our society closer to justice.
You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a podcast and event series hosted by Chanda Smith Baker. Up next, Nicholas Buccola, a writer, lecturer, and teacher who describes one of the most important debates over race in America, the debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley Jr.
So good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Chanda. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. I really appreciate you taking time with me this morning. I was a bit sad that you weren't able to make it to town because of what we're going through right now, because I wanted for sure my book signed.
Yes.
And
hopefully I'll be able to. The conference I was going to be attending, they're hoping to reschedule like everybody else, so I look forward to returning to the Twin Cities soon, and I will be happy to stop by to sign the book for sure.
Awesome. And then too, I'm just fascinated by your work. And so I'm hoping for our listening audience, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself.
So I am a political theorist by background. So I study kind of ultimate questions about politics, questions like what is justice, what is democracy, what does a well-functioning democracy look like? And I began my career as a scholar working on Frederick Douglass. I was really interested when I was in graduate school in the abolitionist movement, which there hadn't been a lot of work done on the abolitionist movement by political theorists. And that seemed to me to be a really large gap in the literature. A lot of great work by historians, by literary scholars, but political theorists hadn't really thought about what do abolitionists have to teach us about these big questions in politics. And that was what intrigued me as a graduate student. And so my advisor, so I had this idea of writing a dissertation about, the abolitionist political thought. And my advisor said, Nick, we like you a lot, but we want you to leave. So we want you to narrow your scope a little bit. So why don't you pick out one or two abolitionists who you think are especially worth studying in this way? And so I knew enough about Frederick Douglass at that point to know that he was someone who I wanted to spend more time with and wanted to devote some deep thinking to. So I worked on Douglass for quite a while, probably about a decade of between the dissertation and my first couple of books were focused on Douglass. And then Baldwin came into my life kind of by accident. I knew a little bit about Baldwin, but not nearly enough. And Baldwin, I was immediately just sort of taken in by his way of viewing the world. And I had never read anyone quite like him. And he presented a lot of challenges for me as a political theorist because, he was an artist, first and foremost. And so trying to grapple with these big questions as he's dealing with them in fiction and that sort of thing was a big challenge. But I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of time with him. And so once I discovered the debate with Buckley, kind of built from there. But that's a little bit about what I've done scholarly wise, and I teach, on these subjects as well. So great political thinkers, kind of classic books in political theory, African-American political thought, American political thought, constitutional law. Those are sort of that's how I fill most of my days.
Yeah. Were you curious about history and policy as a young person, or was there a moment that kind of led you there?
Yeah. I've been interested in history and politics, for a really long time. I didn't have an especially political family, but for whatever reason, I was always the kid, like I think about my brother and I, like he was the kid who was interested in the Transformers and robots, and I was always interested in the people. And I think just stories about people and understanding how people relate to each other and sort of questions of fairness and justice were really, appealing to me from a very, very young age. My parents remind me of, arguments that I'd have with them when I was just a little little kid about what was fair and what wasn't fair. And now that I have a 6-year-old, I get to have that experience on the other end. So it's always been something, appealing to me. And so I in school, I was the kind of student who had, the things that I liked, I did pretty well in. And the things I didn't like, I struggled in history and literature. And when I got to high school, civics and that sort of thing, those are really the subjects that drew me in. And so I just have always had that kind of interest in politics through, a historical lens. And then, got to college and studied political science, and also got to know philosophy. I went to a Jesuit university that had a lot of, courses, ethics in every subject, ethics in business, ethics in politics, ethics in the law. And that was my kind of, my happy place, really deliberating about those questions, arguing about those questions. And so, for whatever reason, that's kind of been part of who I am from a very early age.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up on the north side of Minneapolis, which is what people will call a historically Black neighborhood. It was a neighborhood that African Americans had to live in due to redlining and housing restrictions. And, my family over the last 5 generations has found a place, a home, a connection, a commitment really to staying in place. And I went to North High School, which is seen as an African American high school. And I had probably a pretty similar sort of leaning as you, literature, history, math and science, not so much. But what I was really struck by, and I also want to mention my Aunt Gladys, who collected books. Mm-hmm. And just a beautiful home, floor to ceiling bookshelves. I saw James Baldwin's books there. Like, I knew of his importance. Mm-hmm. But as I was researching and then discovering, actually through the connection that Curtis the Young made to you, was the debate that I was not familiar with. Mm-hmm. And so I was really hit in a moment of a recognition of how limiting education, or at least public education, or more specifically my education, was on dynamic African-American thought leaders, influencers, that really have informed so much. So I had this deep sense of awe of what was happening. And also right behind it was like this deep sense of like loss and sadness.
Yeah. That's I think that's so true. I mean, I think with Baldwin, one of the things that was really, revelatory for me getting to know Baldwin was I had no sense of just what a big deal, he was, in the international literary scene. So in that moment in 1965, when he's squaring off with Buckley, I mean, Baldwin is one of the most famous writers in the world. And so to have that, to sort of learn that, and then know that, and certainly in high school, I don't think I was, exposed to any James Baldwin. In college, maybe a little bit in kind of my, introduction to, college writing class. I think we probably read Sonny's Blues or something like that. But I think Baldwin is somebody who in some households, is that legacy was alive, but it's certainly for the culture writ large, for a variety of reasons. I think his influence faded, and it's really, I think it's coming back, in the last 10 years or so. There's a lot more attention being paid to Baldwin, and I think we're going to continue to have this kind of Baldwin renaissance. But I hear you. I mean, there is a sort of feeling of sadness, right? You go back and you watch, some of these videos, these films of Baldwin, and you kind of are able to feel this sense of connection and power. And then, you realize that has been lost for so many, for really at least, a generation in a way. And I think it's really, I mean, you mentioned having the house, the house full of books. I mean, I think that's really, really crucial. And it was crucial for Baldwin. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is the ways in which, books were really a lifeline for Baldwin. As a kid, he was somebody who was, obsessed with reading. He, says he read every book, in the library closest to his home. And then he began venturing out to neighborhoods where he wasn't supposed to go to get more books. And that he really found that the power of books to be crucial in connecting people across time and space and making sense of your own experience and trying to be able to navigate the world. And so to bring that back to, where you started, I mean, that's why Baldwin is so important, and keeping Baldwin alive in our minds is so important, is because I think there's, for so many people, reading Baldwin can be an experience that helps make sense of the world and helps, survive in an unjust world. So I think that's why, Baldwin is so important. So I always say, if I can go out and give a talk about this book and it leads somebody to read Baldwin, I feel like I've done a good thing in the world.
And so as you were discovering him, what led you to write the book? And how did you pick these two people to connect in this way at this time?
Yeah. So, I feel very fortunate that I sort of stumbled into, this book, because it's been a really incredible experience to write the book and to sort of get the sort of response that the book's gotten. And really it started with Baldwin, getting to know Baldwin. I was invited to write an essay about Baldwin many years ago, probably about 2012, 2013. And I, at that time did not, had not read that much Baldwin. So it was one of these things where I told the editor of this volume, I said, I'm going to be totally honest with you. I don't know Baldwin that well. I'm not sure you should be inviting me to write this essay. And she said, well, this is now, a friend of mine, Susan McWilliams, who's a political theorist at Pomona College. She said, well, you have a couple years to write the essay. So you can spend a year reading Baldwin and a year writing the essay. I said, okay, that sounds reasonable. And so as I got to know Baldwin, as I said earlier, I just became so, entranced by his way of thinking and way of viewing the world. And I thought, this is somebody who I really need to get to know. And as I was getting to know Baldwin, I came across the YouTube recording, the BBC recording of the debate with Buckley. And Buckley is somebody who was, on my radar growing up and on my radar as a scholar. Not somebody that I was necessarily, interested in writing about, but I have an interest in American political thought, in American, political movements. And so I had some, flirtations with writing about the American conservative movement in the past, and it never really come to, an idea that I really wanted to devote too much time to. But when I saw the debate with Buckley, Buckley and Baldwin, I really became, kind of transfixed. I thought this is such a fascinating contrast, in every possible way. I mean, the life experiences of these two guys is so different. The worldviews are so different. You have them on this international stage at the, high tide of the civil rights movement. So really, like, the drama of that moment really pulled me in, and just a sense like this is, there's something about this clash in itself that really matters, historically. And I wanted to learn as much as I could about the clash. So I used the debate as a framing device in that essay I wrote. And as I worked on the essay, I kept, thinking there's a book in here, there's definitely a book. My first idea was to write a book that was really focused on the debate itself. There had been a couple of, so I was kind of working out that idea. And when I was working out that idea, a couple of books about Malcolm X visiting the Oxford Union in 1964 came out. And so I kind of had an idea of doing something like that, Baldwin at Cambridge. So the first puzzle I wanted to solve was, how did they end up there that night? And so I kind of did this work with my wonderful undergraduate research collaborators at Linfield College. We went and tried to find the students who hosted the debate, because the debate was 1965, so 50 years on. Those Cambridge students, those who were still with us, were in their 70s, and so we tried to track down those students so I could interview them and get that story. And then once I had that story, as I dug into the archives, at that point Buckley's archive was open at Yale. Baldwin's archive wasn't yet open in Harlem, but it opened during the course of my working on the book. But the more I learned about their lives, the more I realized that there was a bigger book to write, which was the story of the debate is obviously fascinating in itself and really important and constitutes the climactic moment in this narrative. But the story of their lives, these two guys are born in the same city. They're both born in New York City, 15 months apart from each other. And as I say in the introduction to the book, they may as well have been born on different planets. I mean, it's just the experiences they had, and trying to trace out how they develop as individuals, and mostly how they develop as intellectuals. They both come of age intellectually right around the same time, the late 40s, early 50s. So what I wanted to do is as I worked on the research for the book, I realized a much bigger book was was what I really had to do, which was a story about weaving their lives against the backdrop of the rise of the civil rights and conservative movements. And those movements obviously are movements that they are playing in respectively such a big part in shaping. So that's kind of how the book evolved. And it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of, it was really, they're both fascinating characters in different ways. And the history is so rich, and they both, because they're so prolific as writers, they really give us, as readers, as scholars, kind of a glimpse into their mind every day, as they're writing letters, as they're writing, publishing things. So you kind of get to watch them, think through these issues as they're happening. And so that's kind of the story of the book.
Yeah. And as, we'll talk more about the debate itself. So we have these two guys born around the same time in the same relative geographical area that had very different experiences and realities, which is not an unfamiliar American story. It's quite sad or disappointing that we could probably write another book like this in the times that we live in now, 50 years from now.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. Who were the students that actually set up this debate? Like, what was happening at Cambridge that allowed for this?
Yeah, so the story of how the debate came to be is also a story of a series of accidents in some ways. And Baldwin was they were going to bring out a paperback edition of his third novel, Another Country, in the UK in early 1965. And so his publisher was, reaching out to basically places in and around London to set up a little book tour for Baldwin. And so essentially, early in 1965, this guy, Bill Collins, Corgi Publishing, and I should say, I sort of was able to uncover this story through the interviews and also through Baldwin's archive. Baldwin kept a lot of the correspondence that sort of led up to the debate, which was really helpful for me as a scholar to be able to tell this story. But yeah, so Baldwin's publicist reaches out to the Cambridge Union, which is a student-run organization, and the president at that time was a guy named Peter Fullerton, this undergraduate studying history, and so this publicist contacts him and says, James Baldwin, we're wondering if is going on this tour, wondering if he can come to the Cambridge Union to talk about his novel. And Fullerton, as he remembers it, says, well, no, we can't host James Baldwin, even though he's this international celebrity. We can't host him for an author event, but we can host him for a debate. We're a debating society. So if he'd be willing to come to the Cambridge Union to debate something related to the themes of his books, then we would be happy to host him. And so then, the publicist kind of says, okay, well, I'll see if he's willing to do that. And there's still a little bit of mystery as to exactly, when Baldwin knew it would be Buckley he'd be opposing, and when the sort of resolution was formed. The motion they end up debating is the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. And so there's really a very short window of time that this president of the union, Peter Fullerton, had to put together the debate. So he gets the first contact from Baldwin's publicist in January 1965, and the debate happens in February 18th, 1965. Oh, wow. So in that window of time, he comes up with, he and the other students come up with this motion, and they're looking around for somebody for Baldwin to debate. And the first idea they had was to invite an American politician to debate Baldwin. So one thing the Cambridge Union would often do is have politicians come in. So like Theodore Roosevelt had spoken to the Cambridge Union back in the day. They had members of parliament come through to speak all the time. And so Fullerton says he can't remember exactly who he tried to invite, but he thinks that it was probably some of the leading senators opposed to civil rights. So he thinks he probably invited Strom Thurmond. He thinks he probably invited, Barry Goldwater, who had just lost the 64 election. In part, he was defined by his vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. None of those senators were willing to share a stage with James Baldwin. I mean, it's an interesting idea to imagine James Baldwin up there with Strom Thurmond, and that would have been even maybe a more crazy event. But yeah. There was one undergraduate at Cambridge, this guy named Michael Tugendhat, who had met William F. Buckley in 1963 when he was traveling the United States, and through kind of a friend of a family friend, a friend of a friend kind of a thing. And he doesn't recall how much he knew about Buckley, but he knows he knew enough to know that he would be a worthy opponent for Baldwin. I think they realized pretty quickly that Buckley was this famed debater, that he was a leading supporter of the Goldwater campaign, that, they probably, if they did much research at all about him, knew that he was a critic of the civil rights movement. I don't know if they knew that he had already been expressed, very clearly his opposition to James Baldwin, but they kind of got enough information about him to know that this could be quite a matchup. And so they reached out to Buckley, who was on his annual, one of the things Buckley would do, this is one of these kind of symbols of his privilege. Every year he would go to Switzerland for a month to ski and socialize and write a book. That was kind of his, for about a month and a half. So he was in Switzerland at the time, and so they reached out to him and said, would you be willing to debate James Baldwin? And Buckley was always eager to debate anyone, especially somebody who he disagreed with. And so he accepted, and that's kind of the story of how they got there that night. And so I get into a lot of detail about that in the book. And I should say that Baldwin's agent tried to cancel the debate a week before it happened because he did not like the idea of Baldwin sharing a stage with Buckley. Because Buckley was, as Baldwin's agent put it, a master at getting under your skin, and he was worried about Baldwin sort of sharing a stage with Buckley. He thought that could go in all sorts of bad directions, and so Baldwin was not that intimidated by people like Buckley. So my suspicion is that although the debate was actually, there's a telegram that I found in Baldwin's archive canceling the debate. His agent sends a note canceling the debate. It didn't end up getting canceled, obviously. So I suspect that Baldwin, was far less concerned about it than his agent was. And so he went forward. He felt a responsibility to take on Buckley, I think.
And so Buckley is seen as one of the founding fathers of the conservative movement. Can you describe what that means? So it was beyond just his own ideology and his own writing that his legacy has left. Can you describe what it means for him to be the one of the founding fathers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the other really important parts of, why I think this pairing of these two individuals together, really, really matters. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, just having their life experiences next to each other tells really this broader American story about privilege and about access to the American dream, but also this kind of role that each of them plays in kind of embodying movements is I think the other really important part of the story. And so Buckley is somebody who, is important in his own right in terms of his worldview, but he's actually really more important, as your question indicates, in terms of his role in building a movement, his role in being a kind of organizer and popularizer of ideas. So Buckley is somebody who has this, this upbringing that we can talk about later if you'd like, that is clearly he has a kind of worldview that's, built into, his life from a very young age from his parents is essentially, devout religiosity, devout kind of conservative Catholicism, and also a kind of doctrine that they called individualism, which is kind of this hostility to any form of collectivism, communism, socialism, the New Deal policies of Franklin Roosevelt. The Buckleys are sort of taught to be hostile to democracy as well. They're taught to believe that some people are fit to rule and others are fit to be ruled. So Buckley kind of has this kind of right-wing worldview as he's growing up. But in the kind of founding father role, Buckley, when he's in the early 50s, he's looking around at the political scene, and there really isn't something we can call a conservative movement. And Buckley, what he wants to do is try to play a role in forming a movement. And the way he wants to do that is through founding a magazine. So Buckley had written a couple of books that were panned by the reviewers, but proved to be really provocative in the early 50s. One about his experiences at Yale and all the ways in which liberal professors were indoctrinating students in the wrong ideological direction, and then a second book defending Senator Joseph McCarthy, the leader of the latest Red Scare. But Buckley wants to. He sees that in the early part of the 20th century, magazines played a really important role in shaping and promoting the progressive movement. So magazines like The Nation and The New Republic played this really important role in American political development. And so Buckley is thinking that if he can start a magazine that would bring together various factions on the right, and under one banner, that he might kind of play this role of creating a serious intellectual conservative movement. And so he finds, people who are libertarians, who are especially worried about what they see as excessive state intervention in economic affairs, and people who call themselves traditionalists, who are especially worried about the perceived decline of religion and morality in the West. He wants to bring, these groups don't like each other very much, but he's hoping he can bring them together, and the glue that will hold them together is what they don't like, right? They don't like communism. They don't like liberalism. And so Buckley's playing this role of kind of bringing these groups together. And this is right in this moment when he's founding the magazine, 1954, 1955. This is a crucial moment, right, in the development of the civil rights movement, right? So we have the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision in 1954, the backlash against that decision in the South. You have the lynching of Emmett Till. You have, of course, the arrest of Rosa Parks, the rise of Martin Luther King, the Montgomery bus boycott. All that is happening right at the same time that Buckley is founding the magazine. So as a movement builder, Buckley is confronted with this question: how are we, what he thinks of as we, the intellectual conservatives, going to respond to the rise of the civil rights movement, or this latest phase in the civil rights movement? And he makes it very clear from the beginning that he believes conservatives should oppose the civil rights movement almost every step of the way. And so that's really one of the major stories that I try to tell in the book. And this is a story that, it's not new to this book, but I try to get into it in, kind of more depth and detail than maybe has been done before, to try to capture how Buckley was thinking through what he called a non-racist, but not reflexively racially egalitarian response to civil rights might look like. So he thought he was walking kind of a middle way. And so what I try to do in really, great detail in the book is reconstruct his thinking on that, and who he, hired to write for the magazine to oppose civil rights, and, essentially how that helps us make sense of not only that era, but where we are today.
Sure. And just, one little quick question to follow that up is that I think what I either heard you say or what I read in the book is that while Buckley opposed all the things that you stated, he seemed not to disagree with the bus boycott, because that was an economic challenge. Mm-hmm. I couldn't quite figure out his delineation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is the one, there's a couple moments, even in the early years of National Review, this magazine he founds, when they aren't quite as, intransigent in their opposition to the civil rights struggle. And so the one kind of exception to most of, this generally, this position of opposition is that Buckley argues that economic boycotts are a legitimate form of social protest. And so essentially what he argues is that, in the case of the Montgomery bus boycott, it's this kind of strange argument when you think about it in a broader context. So on the one hand, he says, look, there should not be, and there are things that the state of Alabama was doing to try to make boycotting itself illegal, right? And this is one of the things that when King is brought into, to court, this is one of the things that Alabama is trying to punish him for leading a boycott, right? And so Buckley does say that this is not a legitimate use of the law. He thinks that they should allow economic boycotts. And essentially what he says, though, is that the white population that wants to maintain segregation, they need to be willing to pay for the cost of the boycott, essentially, is what he argues. So he says if the boycott holds, and one of the reasons that Montgomery was trying to prosecute King is because they were missing out on the bus fares of African Americans who were boycotting. And so that was a problem for the city. So they're trying to sort of end the boycott. But Buckley says, no, what they should do is just make the white passengers pay twice the rate. So if they're willing to pay 10 cents a ride instead of 5 cents a ride, then that's a price they're willing to pay. And that's, for him, that was perfectly fine. So Buckley, the part of this, it's a little bit, I think difficult. On the one hand, you're sort of, you have this moment where maybe you're a little proud of Buckley for kind of taking a stand that seems to be a little bit less hostile to civil rights. On the other hand, when you think about it in context, it's not especially laudatory, right? Because he says to African Americans in Montgomery, you should be willing to pay for your own bus line, right? So the city's not going to allow you, the city's going to maintain a segregated bus line. So why don't you just create your own bus line? Now that in theory, of course, maybe there's some appeal to that, but in practice, in terms of the economic disparities in that context, that's it's kind of a silly proposition. So I think that's kind of this one moment where Buckley does, and later on a little bit later on in the sort of civil rights timeline, he will, the sit-in protesters, he objects to sit-in protesting because he says it's a violation of private property rights, but he says it's perfectly acceptable for those students who are protesting to boycott, Woolworths and places that are not, that have segregated lunch counters. But yeah, he tries to draw these lines. As I argue in the book, in the larger context of, power relationships in the South, a lot of his alternative proposals, they seem to lose a lot of their appeal.
Yeah. And then we have James Baldwin, who came into scene, and he did not describe himself as a civil rights leader. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Do you think that he was conflicted by what that meant?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and it's one that Baldwin himself, grappled with throughout his career. I mean, so Baldwin, he thinks of himself primarily, right, as an artist. Like he thinks, his primary vocation, his primary passion is as an artist. Certainly, I think he was most comfortable in that role, writing novels, writing short stories, writing plays. But he, from a very early on in his writing career, he is somebody who's also, very clearly a just an incredible essayist, right? An incredible at capturing the kind of depth of human conflict, the depth of moments, historical moments. And so he's writing essays from a very, very early on in his writing career. And in the 50s, right? So he leaves the U.S. in 1948, and he lives in Paris for most of the time between 1948 and 1957. And he's still writing about American racial issues during that time. He's writing, a lot of book reviews. He's writing some essays, but he feels drawn back to the United States to engage more directly with what's happening. And he, gives these really powerful, he describes really powerful moments, in his autobiographical essays where, he's seeing the headlines, right? When he's in Paris, he's seeing, pictures of children trying to, attend school after the school desegregation decisions. And he's seeing all the protests and the backlash happening around them. And he can see that, and he's feeling really drawn, a sense of responsibility to return and to engage more directly. And so he starts out, though, in his primary engagement, his first trip to the South in the late 50s, for example, is as a journalist. So Baldwin goes as a journalist to cover the civil rights movement for American magazines. And he describes in that period, like he says, my role is I am a witness, right? This is one of the terms that he uses, as opposed to an activist or somebody really on the front lines. Baldwin says, I'm a witness. My job is to write it all down. And he's there's a kind of, as his star is rising, he's becoming more and more famous and prominent over that period in the late 50s and the early 1960s. I think, that line begins to blur between like a witness and an activist. He never wants to be, like a quote unquote spokesman. He sort of objects to that label for himself. What he wants to try to do is capture really the depth of the experience that people are having in various parts of this struggle. And so, I think really most powerfully in that witness role, you see Baldwin, one of the most powerful pieces for me was, a piece that he wrote called The Fly in Buttermilk, which is a piece where he goes to North Carolina in his first trip to the South, and he sits down with a 15-year-old kid who's, the first African-American student in a previously all-white school. And he wants to try to capture what the world looks like through his eyes. And this is always what Baldwin is trying to do, is to try to see the world through the eyes of others and try to get his readers to do the same. And so he sits down with this young man and tries to understand what it's like for him to, show up that first day at school and have the white students forming an arm-in-arm barricade, to keep him out. What it's like for him to be subjected to physical and verbal assaults on a regular basis. What it's like for him to see his parents, subjected to, harassment as a result of their decision to send him to this school. And so Baldwin really tries to give us a sense of what that looks like from the inside. And he also, in those days, is trying to get a sense of what it looks like, from perspectives like the perspective of the white principal of that school. And Baldwin sits down with this principal and tries to get a sense of he's not as interested in this guy's views of Brown v. Board or the school integration program in North Carolina. He's interested in kind of what it's like for him to play this role that he's playing, right? He's somebody who's been taught his whole life to believe in white supremacy, and he's been taught his whole life to believe one of his roles is to maintain, the fortress of white supremacy. And now he's in this position where that's being challenged. His entire worldview is being challenged. So Baldwin, I think he really wanted to he thought that was his job, is to try to give us a sense of what that's like. And also, when he sat down with Martin Luther King, he sat down with Medgar Evers, he wanted to try to get a sense of how these folks were, bearing this incredible responsibility, and he wanted to try to understand what that was like, right, and what that meant for them as human beings, and try to glean from their experience what that can teach the rest of us about what true heroism is, what true devotion to liberty is. That's really what Baldwin is trying to get at. So there are moments, right, when when I refer to Baldwin as a voice, or one of the key voices of the Black liberation struggle, or as civil rights firebrand, there's these terms that we tend to associate with him, but they're terms that he was always a little bit uncomfortable with. As he gets more famous, he in 1963, for example, after his most famous book, The Fire Next Time, comes out, he does really just go on a kind of a stump speaking. He's like on tour basically, doing speeches for the Congress of Racial Equality, and is really engaged in much more of what we would call activism. And I think he feels he feels like that's the right thing to do in that moment. But after doing that for several months, he does feel this kind of sense of spiritual exhaustion, and he does feel drawn to get back to his art. But that's always going to be the balance that he's trying to strike between his kind of role as an artist and his role as somebody who does want to engage in the struggle for justice.
Mm-hmm. So now we get to, the debate, and, it was really curious as I was watching it for me to say, we talked a little bit on why would James Baldwin participate in this, mm-hmm. right? And then I thought about myself, and that even with these conversations that we've been hosting at the Minneapolis Foundation, and I remember the very first one, we had Dr. Robin DiAngelo come, mm-hmm. and I didn't know her, mm-hmm. right? And she's flying in, for whatever circumstance. And so we're literally meeting as I'm walking into the room. Mm-hmm. And so here I am, African-American woman, talking to a white woman about white fragility in front of a white audience. Mm-hmm. And, I recently talked with my CEO, RT, and I just said, man, I've talked about decolonizing wealth in front of these audiences. And I'm like, this could go wickedly wrong, right? There's a level of vulnerability, I suppose, going into that. And I'm certainly not living in the times that Baldwin was living in. And so even when you watch the debate, right? As a brown person, you're looking for other brown people in the audience. And I think I saw two, and I'm thinking, number one, just the relatability of what it means, right? To kind of carry a weight or a value that you live through your work and stay consistent to. Yeah. But I also thought, did Baldwin give more credibility to Buckley's perspective? Did he dignify it? Mm-hmm. Or did his participation elevate Baldwin's mm-hmm. Presence, right? Was it about changing heart and minds? Was it beyond Buckley? And was Buckley trying to gain supporters on kind of a white supremacist, more conservative? I know there's debate on how you connect the two, but who was dignified in that situation, or did it elevate the right things, do you think, to the audience?
Yeah, wow, that's a That's a great question, and it's yeah, and I appreciate you connecting it to your own experience, right? Because that's really powerful. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a couple big things to say here. One is that Baldwin, there is something really there's something sort of painful about watching the debate. There's many things painful about watching the debate, and I think depending on people's own experiences, that sort of how they receive, how they experience the debate, varies considerably. I remember, one of the really powerful moments for me when I was, in the first, early weeks after the book came out, was I was visiting a college campus in California, and one of the professors in the audience recalled, watching the debate, with her parents when she was young, when she was a kid. And that she remember her recollection of it was a recollection of pain, right? Of sort of the experience of seeing Baldwin, in that overwhelmingly white space, trying to defend his humanity across the stage from Buckley, who is so dismissive, and we'll talk about Buckley's speech, I'm sure. It's so condescending. It was, she was describing just the pain, and also like that feeling of like Baldwin shouldn't be there, right? And I think that's a really powerful, idea to consider, as we reflect on the debate and why it matters historically, and what Baldwin felt why he was there and what he felt his responsibility to be there was. So to go back to your question, right? So I think there's a couple things to say about Baldwin's thinking as far as, I'm able to capture it, 50 plus years later, is that Baldwin, he felt a sense of duty. He felt a sense of responsibility to engage in these sorts of conversations. The one example that I came across in Baldwin's archive actually was, late 1962, he sits down and has a debate with James Jackson Kilpatrick, who is known as the sort of one of the leading salesmen for segregation in the country. So Kilpatrick was a journalist, a writer who had essentially devoted his professional life to defending segregation. And I should say, as a side note, he was Buckley's go-to guy on race, one of Buckley's favorite writers on race for the magazine. Baldwin is invited in late 1962 to engage with Kilpatrick on television, on the Open Mind television program, on the question of segregation. And so it's in some ways an even more stark, contrast. I mean, Buckley was a little more nuanced in his white supremacy than Kilpatrick, but Baldwin, none of Baldwin's, his agents, his friends want him to go on with Kilpatrick. Baldwin feels a duty to go on and to confront Kilpatrick and to try to expose Kilpatrick for what he is. And that is something we see with the Buckley exchange as well. So Baldwin goes into these exchanges feeling a sense of obligation to try to, reveal, before these audiences and, these, international audience in the case of Cambridge, what Buckley really is. And I think Baldwin does it in a more kind of nuanced way at Cambridge than he does with Kilpatrick. With Kilpatrick, he just goes right in. The first thing the show starts, and this is right after the battle at Ole Miss, when there had been, violent riots to resist James Meredith, an African-American Air Force veteran, from registering for classes at the University. Yeah. And so, Baldwin goes right in, right when they're welcome to the show, and he says, "Mr. Kilpatrick, you think there's a difference between people like you who write fancy books and wear fancy suits and defend segregation and the people in the streets who are committing acts of racist violence?" And Baldwin says, "There is no difference. In fact, I hold you far more responsible than I hold those people in those streets, because many of those people don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. They're doing what they've been taught to do their entire lives, and they've been taught to do that by people like you." And so that's how, Baldwin says that's what, I accuse you, Kilpatrick, not of betraying me, but of betraying them. You are undermining their moral lives, is what he accuses. So I think Baldwin in part wants to go into Cambridge and say to Buckley in a kind of more nuanced way, but I think a pretty powerful, direct way when you really think about what Baldwin says during the course of his speech, is to say that Buckley is part of, he is a guardian of the fortress of white supremacy. He has been, promoting ideas over the course of his career that have allowed people to rationalize a resistance to respecting the basic dignity and freedom of other human beings. And so, Baldwin wrote this really powerful essay in the 50s called Stranger in the Village. And it's this essay where he describes the experience of being in this Swiss village where he says, as far as I could tell, they'd never seen anyone who looked like me before. And the essay kind of uses that experience of being in this small Swiss village as a kind of metaphor for being a stranger in the village of Western civilization. So there's Baldwin at the Cambridge Union, the world's oldest debating society, a sort of training ground for British elites. And he says, right, he reminds the audience, right, the doctrine of white supremacy came to the United States from Europe, and he says, it's a little awkward for me to say this here. And so, I mean, in many ways, Baldwin is trying to remind the audience that, they are all complicit, right, in a way, in many of the structures of power and many of the ways of thinking that have, contributed to injustice throughout history. And so that's I think that's part of the reason why Baldwin feels an obligation to go there, is that he was not one to turn down any of these opportunities to make those sorts of, statements. It's really a sermon he delivers there. It's a sermon. He calls it he says, I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah. I'm here to tell you things you don't want to hear. And that is precisely what he does at Cambridge. And so that, I think, is the best defense of Baldwin deciding to go there. Now, I think just to get to I'll stop talking. Just one more thing to say about this.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, your point is a really important one, though, is that even if we say Baldwin is right as a matter of principle, like, okay, I can get that. He feels a duty to engage. He feels a duty to call these people out in the most powerful way possible. There is the unintended consequence of potentially elevating their platform, right? And so There's no question about it that Baldwin is the more famous figure in that debate. And so he is, by allowing Buckley to share that stage with him, Buckley is already a famous person in the United States. There's no doubt about it. He's second only to Barry Goldwater at that point as a kind of face of the conservative movement. But that exchange with Baldwin and then the later exchange they have on American television in New York, that definitely helps, Buckley's star rise even higher. And Buckley the next year will have his own television program that will go on to run for 33 years. And in some ways, I mean, Buckley's rise, there's a lot that, Baldwin, kind of unintentionally might help Buckley rise. Buckley runs for mayor of New York City later that year and uses Baldwin as kind of a part of his stump speech, right? So there's a way in which, by Baldwin giving Buckley attention, as you point out, kind of has this unintended consequence, at least in part, of raising Buckley's profile.
Right. So, I encourage everyone listening to go and watch the full debate. It's so dynamic, and there's so many layers, including when Baldwin gets up and he referenced Jeremiah from this biblical way, and he's got this pastoral background, to the wonderful way in which he weaves in kind of his personal story and conditions and involves audience, which felt like a very different framing than what Buckley brought. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to summarize kind of the points of view, to kind of tease people into perhaps going to listen to the full debate?
Yeah. So the way the debate was structured was you had two undergraduates speak first. And so each, there was somebody on Baldwin's side and somebody on Buckley's side. And again, the motion was the American dream is the expense of the American Negro. The two students speak first, and then Baldwin gets up to deliver his speech. And Baldwin's speech is 24 minutes long, and the BBC recording available on YouTube has Baldwin's speech in its entirety. Buckley's speech is another story. I'll tell folks about that in a minute. But Baldwin's speech is there in its entirety, and Baldwin, he really wants to deliver this, sermon about white supremacy. And so I would say there's three, maybe four major components to it, just to give people a brief sense of what he's up to. The first thing he wants to do is to try to draw our attention to the ways in which the doctrine of white supremacy impacts what he calls the subjugated, right? So those who are the obvious targets of the doctrine. So he describes in very powerful terms the millions of details of every day that communicate to you that your life doesn't matter quite as much, that you are a worthless human being. So he talks about, the police officers, the landladies, the landlord, the insurance agents, and so on. All these kind of millions of details that every day that communicate this message to you that undermines your dignity. So he describes that in really powerful terms. And then he says, but what I want to say is that is not the worst of it, right? What is even worse than the experience that you have as an individual is you start to see in the next generation, right? You start to think about the fact that, the next generation is likely to experience something very similar to what you've experienced, right? And that in part is Baldwin directly, kind of drawing a question about the mythology of the American dream, right? Part of the American dream is to say that even if your life is not full of freedom and opportunity, you can have a hope that the next generation will have it better than you did. And Baldwin says that, for parents, at the margins of society, they are haunted by the fact that they're haunted by the idea that their children and even their children's children may not indeed have much more freedom and opportunity than they had. And so Baldwin kind of draws our attention to that and the ways in which that, is likely to play out in the future. But then I'd say the second major component of Baldwin's speech is to say that the so-called beneficiaries or the would-be beneficiaries of white supremacy are also its victims, right? So Baldwin says that there are people in the United States and around the world, right, who are taught to believe that their value as human beings is bound up with their whiteness, right? And so Baldwin says that, for him, that is, in some ways, an even deeper crime. And so there's a really powerful line when Baldwin says that, you see in that moment, that historical moment, is about as powerful an example as Baldwin could give. He says, think about Sheriff Jim Clark in Selma, Alabama. In that moment, Jim Clark, people are seeing him on television and newspapers, brandishing his cattle prod, right, and using it against men, women, and children, fighting for their rights. Baldwin says when Jim Clark, uses his cattle prod, what's happening to his victim is ghastly, but in some ways what's happening to Clark is much, much worse. And Baldwin says that the way he explains that is that Jim Clark's moral life has been destroyed by the plague called color, right? So Jim Clark has been taught to believe that his value as a human being is rooted in his whiteness and that his role in the world is to protect white supremacy. Baldwin says, his freedom, his flourishing has been completely destroyed by this doctrine. And so Baldwin wants to draw our attention to that as well. And then I would say the last thing I'd say about, Baldwin's speech is that he also wants to think about this idea of expense, right? So the motion, again, being framed as this frame of expense. And what Baldwin does really, really powerfully, one of the most, striking moments in his speech is Baldwin says to those students, he says, I mean this quite literally, I picked the cotton. I carried it to market. And he goes on like that and really personalizes it. And that moment is like, for the listener and for the viewer, is just kind of, it's an overwhelming moment, right? It's so powerful. And Baldwin is trying to capture something that we are, obviously, on our good days, still grappling with in American society and internationally as well, is really the question of legacy, right? The question of where past meets present. And the ways in which, Baldwin is personalizing it in that way because he wants to say the past is not past, right? History, history is present in everything we do. There's so many details of every single day, every single moment that are in some ways determined or shaped by that history. And so Baldwin really wants to draw the attention to the students of the ways in which they are implicated in that. And Baldwin says, I am not, interested in your guilt. I am interested in your responsibility, right? It's not about guilt. It's about responsibility. You can tell me until you're blue in the face. I wasn't there. I didn't do this. That my grandparents didn't do this. This is one of the arguments that Buckley makes. And Baldwin says, I don't care. You are still responsible because you are a human being and you are part of a world in which that history has shaped the moment that you're in. So I would say that's the other kind of big highlight to draw in for people to think about from Baldwin's side. And then on Buckley's side, so the thing I'll say about Buckley briefly is that Buckley's speech is actually edited down. So the BBC recording that folks can watch on YouTube had to fit within an hour. And there really was not any good place to cut Baldwin's speech. Buckley's speech is longer, so it's 29 minutes long. There was a little more room to cut. And it's a meandering speech. And so for folks who want to hear the entirety of Buckley's speech, it is available on the audiobook as an appendix. You can hear the full audio recording of the debate, which we were able to find during the course of the research, which was really, really fascinating. And so Buckley gives this kind of meandering speech. Buckley was always, from his earliest days as a debater, and he was a debater, a formal debater going back to, the age of probably, 13, 14 years old once he started prep school. So he's a very skilled formal debater. He was always sort of recognized for his ability to rebut, right? He was not especially good at constructing arguments. He was always good at undermining the arguments of others. And so he's in that mode, certainly. He wants to go after Baldwin. He sees Baldwin give his speech. Baldwin gets a standing ovation, which is a very rare thing at the Cambridge Union. And Buckley, says later, I knew it wasn't going to be my night. And so he says, I had to decide, should I, try to placate the audience a little bit and win a few more votes, or should I just go for the jugular? And he chooses to go for the jugular. And he starts out by essentially, ad hominem attack at Baldwin. Essentially, he says Baldwin is essentially, people don't challenge his arguments because he is black. People are not willing to respect him enough to actually tell him when he's wrong. So Buckley says, I am here to respect him enough. And the way Buckley phrases this is really awkward. He says, I'm going to respect Baldwin enough to treat him as if he were white, is what Buckley starts out his speech with, that, which is obviously, as we watch it now, it's one of these moments when the reaction shot of Baldwin, captures how most of us, when we hear that, go, oh my God, what is he saying? But then Buckley goes from there to say, okay, well, I'm going to respect him enough to actually respond to his arguments. Then Buckley proceeds to really, create a kind of straw man of Baldwin's arguments. The first major strategy that Buckley uses is to try to convince this elite British audience that Baldwin is a dangerous radical hell-bent on overthrowing Western civilization. So he says to the students, he wants you to go raid the libraries around here and burn all the Plato and Aristotle and the Bibles, and that he wants you to overthrow, what Buckley calls later in the speech, the faith of your fathers. And I get in a lot of detail in the book of the ways in which that's a really, flawed reading of what Baldwin's up to. In some ways, Baldwin was much more deeply engaged with the kind of Western tradition than Buckley was. I mean, Baldwin was very interested in, there's a lot in Western civilization, Western tradition that's worth rejecting, Baldwin would argue, but he was very interested in engaging it in a serious way and reflecting about the ways in which, we can help make sense of where we are and where we ought to go by reading sort of the classics that Buckley was discussing. But then Buckley goes on to sort of describe, various ways in which Baldwin is wrong in his diagnosis of the American racial situation for a variety of reasons. And Buckley offers, I think, the most substantive moment in Buckley's speech, I guess, would be toward the end of it when he says that his diagnosis of what he calls the American racial situation is it's the product of what he calls an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. And I think Buckley's phrasing is really important, to capture kind of his worldview, especially as it applies to race. He says that on the one hand, there are individual racist white people out there. And he uses that term, individual white people, in this part of the speech. And I think that's really important. He says there's individual racists out there that they need to be dealt with. They need to be convinced, not by the law, not through the law, but through moral persuasion that they're wrong and they shouldn't be racist. Now, what's interesting about that is, on the one, first of all, the use of individual, because he's saying it's kind of this few bad apples argument. There are a few bad apples out there, and they need to be taught the error of their ways. That's one really important thing to know. The other is that Buckley is then placing himself outside of racism, right? He's saying the racists, need to be dealt with, and we, the good people, need to help, sort them, teach them the right way. So that, the 10 years prior to that, when Buckley had been promoting in his magazine and on, in his speaking and all his, his platform that was significant, he had been promoting, a pretty, deeply, racist politics in a more subtle way than, people like George Wallace. But I argue in the book, it's pretty hard to vindicate what Buckley was up to in the 50s and 60s. I mean, he was he was engaged in some pretty, some pretty nasty stuff that was essentially reaching the exact same conclusion that people like George Wallace were reaching with a little more nuance. So Buckley's excluding himself from that, which I think is really something we need to interrogate if we're going to really understand what racism is. We need to understand that racism is a concept that does not require the expression of animus, right? Buckley thought of racism as like it needs to have animus for it to be racist, and I think we now, those of us who are thinking about these issues, know that is simply too narrow a definition. And then the second thing Buckley says, the unfortunate conjunction is these racist white people on the one side, and he says, and then the other side is failures of the Negro community is the phrase that Buckley uses. So we have individuals over here, we have the community over here, and I don't think that's a mistake. Buckley, I mean, we're getting a sense of his kind of more subtle racist politics with that phrasing, right? He's saying that the failures of the Negro community, as he's describing it, are failures to take advantage of the opportunities that currently exist. And so he says, so it's kind of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of argument, an argument that we've heard a lot in the period since Buckley made that argument 55 years ago. And he says that I call on James Baldwin to be a responsible leader, and a responsible leader would encourage his people, as Buckley puts it, to take advantage of the opportunities that exist rather than complaining all the time, is essentially what Buckley argues. And so Buckley kind of, and then he kind of concludes his speech with this very dramatic, essentially, not a call for a race war, but he says, if people reach out for radical solutions like the ones that Baldwin is promoting, he's accusing Baldwin of promoting, then we will take up arms and we will fight it out, not only in the Cambridge Union, but also in the landing grounds and on the mountains, on the hillsides. He used the kind of Churchill language from World War II to kind of situate the Black freedom struggle with the Nazis in the analogy, and people like him with the Allies. And he kind of ends the speech with this rhetorical flourish, kind of saying, we will fight it out and we will win. And that will be, and Baldwin's grandchildren will thank us, kind of argument that we'll be doing something positive for future generations if we win that battle. So that's Buckley's speech, kind of in a nutshell. And of course, watching them deliver the speeches, I think the last point I'll make is stylistically, I think there's a lot that we can learn, in actually watching them, listening to them, that I think really captures something important. The substance of their speeches matters, but also the way they deliver them, I think, also tells a really important story about what these two men were all about.
Mm-hmm. I have, I think, two more questions. One is, there are people that, the George Wallaces and the Strom Thurmans and folks that evolved over time. Right. As they aged, they took on different opinions. I don't know, some apologies came, whether or not you accept them or not. Did Buckley evolve to a different place as he aged?
Yeah, Buckley did. And so the narrative of the book really, there's, the two chapters on the debate itself, and then a chapter about later, like sort of the rest of 1965, which is got a lot happens relevant to this story. And then so the kind of major narrative of the book kind of wraps up in late 65. And then I have an epilogue where I talk a little bit about their legacies. And I do try to address this sort of question of Buckley's evolution. So Buckley, he does evolve a bit. And so one of the things I try to capture in the book is the ways in which he's evolving, even in this period I'm looking at, from, saying things in the late 50s that are, sort of very much, explicitly like, there's his most infamous editorial is called Why the South Must Prevail, where he says, the white South is entitled to prevail because, and this is a quote, for the time being, they are the advanced race. So he says things like that, where we can clearly situate him in kind of a sort of explicitly white supremacist position to, like, by the mid 60s, he's evolving a little bit in his rhetoric, right? He's not using that sort of language anymore. He's trying to, kind of utilize a more subtle politics of racial resentment. So I try to really capture that in some detail in the book. And the later period, after the debate, Buckley begins to, kind of write things that I think we would describe as a little bit more progressive on race in the early 70s and in the 80s. And what happens with Buckley, and some of that is, contextual sort of particular issues that are coming up at the time. Buckley kind of saying some things more, kind of gesturing in a direction of kind of being more comfortable with affirmative action, for example, than we would think he would be. And then later in his life, he dies in 2008, in early 2008. So later in his life, he is confronted with, these questions as he's, getting, later on in his years, does he have any regrets? And I think when he's asked those questions, I think a lot of the interviewers are trying to get him to say, I'm sorry for what I did in the 50s and 60s on the civil rights movement. And what there's certainly a lot of people who've written, things. The most prominent is a guy named Alvin Felsenberg, has a book about Buckley. That's a good political biography of Buckley. Who's written quite a bit about what he sees as Buckley's story. The story of Buckley and race is a story of, ultimately a story of redemption. I kind of went into this book kind of accepting that story as true, and the research I did led me to a kind of more a not so clear position on that, because I should say I'm not totally convinced by Felsenberg's argument and others who've made that argument. Buckley does say late in life that the closest he comes to a retraction or an apology is he's asked if he has any regrets, and he says, I once believed that the country could evolve its way up from Jim Crow without federal intervention. I was wrong. But the same time, that same last 10 years of his life, you can find other examples of Buckley, essentially saying, I was right as a matter of principle. So he's on, Fresh Air with Terry Gross on NPR late in his life, and she reads to him from that 1957 editorial, which is his most infamous on race, and he's essentially unwilling to retract, anything he said there. He basically says, I was right. So I think one of the big questions, and part of what I argue in the book, is that, I think we can have the debates about Buckley and evolution, and I think they're worth having in terms of our understanding of Buckley as a historical figure. But in some ways, I think they are less important than really capturing in this moment, that I'm looking at in the book, when he had this incredibly, this incredible platform, 3 newspaper columns a week, all speaking, always, talking head on TV, radio, the magazine. He's got the ear of politicians. He's somebody who, in that time, when he had this tremendous influence, used it, to promote this agenda. And I think we really need to understand, why he did that and how he did that and how it's relevant to us. So, and there's. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, it also strikes me that just because you advance the way that you communicate something, right? Like the times are changing. And so what was once acceptable is no longer acceptable. So just because you formulate a new way of discussing something doesn't mean that you have changed your position. And it's very much that, like, it's way more nuanced.
Yeah.
And so it's just quite interesting. The last thing is around, I think you said that Buckley really was promoting sort of colorblind policies or race neutral policies. And we hear this conversation a lot now on where we need to have race neutral policies. And I know this is outside of the book and the debate a bit, although it's interesting to hear him framing that at this particular moment in history and hear this conversation coming back up. Mm-hmm. And me, and many of us, not just me, but this examination of, we had so many non-race neutral policies that have led us to this place of disparity. Mm-hmm. And now we want to be fair, which is actually only going to exacerbate the issue. Or at least that's my opinion on it. So do you have any sort of context that you can provide in terms of people that are looking at or talking about race neutral policy? And is that even a thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and this is really one of these things. And Buckley, as I argue in the book, he's not somebody, and I think most Buckley people who are very sympathetic to Buckley would say that Buckley's not necessarily somebody who can be looked to as an original thinker, a sort of creator of ideas, but he's really important as a popularizer of ideas. And one idea that he popularizes in the period I'm looking at in the book is this idea of a kind of colorblind approach that in the context matters, right? Because on one level, when you think about colorblind, a colorblind, argument in terms of colorblind constitutionalism or a sort of legal doctrine of colorblindness, on a certain level of abstraction, there's something very appealing about it, right? Of course, like the law should be colorblind. The sort of justice is blindfolded and so on. But if we put that in political context, when is that idea emerging and why? That is a really, really important part of the story. And so to take Buckley as an example, Buckley from pretty early on, as early as the 1950s, he's making a kind of argument for colorblind constitutionalism, which as you pointed out, has become a major trope in contemporary politics. And what he says is that, essentially what's happening in just using the example of voting rights, right? So he says in the area of voting rights, there are people who are calling the South out for racist policies because they are applying the law in a way that is targeting African Americans and excluding them from voting. And so Buckley says in the 50s, and this is an argument he makes again at the Cambridge debate explicitly, he says what Southerners need to do, and this applies not just to the South, right? It's obviously has implications far beyond the South. What Southerners need to do is they need to stop applying the law in a racist way, an explicitly racist way. They need to apply it equally without regard to race. Now, and Buckley is willing to acknowledge that this will have a disparate impact on people who have been previously subjugated, right? He knows that if you have some sort of neutral sort of way of excluding people from voting, then those who have been excluded from educational and economic opportunity in the past are going to be excluded at a higher rate under this new kind of colorblind system. But he says in his mind, that will liberate the South from any taint of racism, right? Because they will now have a colorblind. And he actually says in the 50s, the South can pave the way. He says in one of his early pieces on this, that the South can pave the way for the rest of the country with a model of a kind of race-neutral, colorblind approach that will have ultimately mostly the same effect, right? And so at Cambridge, many years later, he's still advocating that view. So this is in the Voting Rights Act is being debated in this period. It hasn't been enacted yet. And Buckley says, one of the moments in the debate that during the Cambridge Union debates, people in the audience could stand up, like in the House of Commons, and the speaker could acknowledge them for a question or a comment. And one of the things that's cut out of the BBC recording is most of the student questions. So it's one reason it's worth listening to the audio, because you get more student questions for Buckley. But the one that is captured in the recording on the BBC is what ends up to have been a young American sociology instructor, a guy named Earl Hopper. And Buckley's kind of doing this, "What would you have us do?" routine. And Hopper says, "You can start by allowing Black people to vote in Mississippi." And Buckley says, "The problem in Mississippi, sir, is not that Black people aren't voting, it's that too many white people are voting. And what I would advocate is a disenfranchisement of 60%, I think is what he says, of the white people who are currently voting." And so he says the answer is less democracy, not more. And so Buckley kind of, and he ends up advocating that going forward. He essentially says that, that we can use these race neutral policies as the next step. And what's really, I think very clear about this is that the point of going to a race neutral approach is to hollow out the gains of the civil rights movement, right? So, Buckley is surprisingly honest about that, right? And I think that's one thing that, looking at Buckley in this way that I do in the book, he's obviously just one individual, and you can't overgeneralize from one individual story, but by really looking at one individual in this kind of depth and detail really allows us to see how these things evolve over time, and we can apply those to how they evolve politically generally over time. So I think that's a really important part of of this story, and it certainly has relevance down to today, right? As we're looking at how the current Supreme Court is dealing with voting rights, and I think one thing that Baldwin, just to bring Baldwin back in,
Sure.
I don't want to end on Buckley necessarily, but one thing about Baldwin is that Baldwin is somebody who there's so much in in Baldwin's thought that I think is relevant to our current moment. And I think one of the things that's most relevant is Baldwin is really one of his central, the central injunction, the central argument that he makes is that we have to accept our history, right? And we have to come to terms with our history. So, I mean, Baldwin, that's one thing when people would ask him, what should we do? What should we do? You get that question from interviewers all the time. And he would say, I want you to come to terms with your history. I think all of us need to come to terms with our history. And one thing about that colorblind constitutionalism approach is that it is a direct attempt for us to abdicate our responsibility to come to terms with our history. And that's precisely, for Baldwin, that is, that's the worst thing we could do, right? Because we have to come to terms with our history. And Baldwin's not somebody who's going to give us a direct, response to all the policy questions we have before us. But he thinks the foundation of all those policy debates is going to be we have to have the willingness and the courage to come to terms with our history. And he says it's going to be painful, but it's a responsibility that we have as human beings. And it's the only way that we're going to move our society closer to justice.
Yeah. What a perfect way to end this conversation. It's so relevant for today's world and for the work that I'm in philanthropy. I came from the nonprofit side where you're working deep in community. I think for philanthropy, in many respects, it's wrestling with its history, with its way forward. How do we think differently about how we engage with a less charitable way, but in a more equitable way, and one that leans towards justice? And so it's quite a time that we're living in with COVID-19 that is amplifying disparities in ways that are way too difficult to ignore. It's something that we're all proximate to in this moment, but the decisions we make now will matter a lot for our communities, for our nation, for our world. I appreciate you taking time remotely to have this conversation. Nicholas Buccola, the author of The Fire Upon Us. I've made it halfway through that book. By the time you get to Minnesota, I will finish it.
Oh, great.
Probably could have finished it 12 times, but I keep going back and trying to sit with it. And I mean, it's brilliant work. I thank you for your gift and your attention to history and policy.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. This has been a real pleasure. I wish I was there with you in Minneapolis, but I look forward to meeting you in person one day soon. And I appreciate the work that you do. I think that you're doing great work, and I know Baldwin would be proud.
That's awesome. My heart is warmed. Thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Take care of yourself. Thank you.
To listen to more episodes and learn about upcoming events, please visit conversationswithchanda.org. You can follow Chanda on Twitter at Chanda S. Baker. This is Sue Pak-Kienitz from the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Chanda.